Yes, Virginia, the Russians did hack into the environment of the 2016 US presidential election, and they did so in a powerfully uplifting manner. President Putin had addressed humanity via a world historic event that had brought an entire symphony orchestra into a previous war zone, into the very place where mass executions had been carried out prior to the liberation of the area from the murderous scourge of universal terrorism. President Putin spoke to the assembled audience of that world event via a television address, saying in essence, "I see this as remembrance for all victims of terror, no matter the place, and crimes against humanity, and of course of hope, not just for the revival of Palmyra as a cultural asset of the whole of humanity, but for modern civilization from the horrible fate of international terrorism." With these words, President Putin voiced aloud what was already in most everyone's heart. He spoke the obvious. He said, in essence, that humanity is living out a fairy tale dream in believing that terrorism cannot be purged from the landscape of human experience. The symphony concert became acknowledged in many parts of the world as a milestone towards the vital liberation of humanity as a whole from state-sponsored terror, from the perpetual war policies, perpetual regime change ideology, perpetual domination practice, and submission to perpetual aggression, perpetual hate, perpetual inhumanity. This milestone event and what it signified did indeed change the world. Russia had injected a spark of cultural optimism into a dark world. It had hacked into the myth that darkness is power. In a world awash with refugees from countries affected by the evils of terror, domination, war, destruction, and inhumanity, the demonstrated commitment by Russia to actively work for the revival of civilization had affected the world and had affected it in a big way. Russia's commitment to the beauty and dignity of human civilization had elevated the entire world in many respects. It had brought a measure of light into the world. In so doing, it also affected the United States political environment. Russia's spark of light had hacked into it and had injected a measure of sanity into a political vacuum without hope. In this manner, Russia had acquired intangible effect. That's what the political masters had ignored as being impossible. It came as a surprise. Everyone was surprised by the outcome of the US presidential election. The masters were surprised because they believed they had stomped out the light of sanity and civilization in the world. Suddenly there it was again. Naturally, it had affected quite a few people. Russia had brought a sense of cultural optimism back into the political scene that seemed almost dead in the West, in the long dark night that had covered so much of the world with war, terror, poverty, and more war. Yes, Russia played a frontline part in the transformation of the political landscape of the world. It played a part by hacking into the landscape of despair, injecting into it its new paradigm that yes, it is possible for humanity to have a future that inspires joy. This all by itself is worthy a celebration, and it was celebrated in Palmyra. It was also noted in America. It uplifted its political dynamics. The resulting new wave of cultural optimism apparently affected more than is being acknowledged or even recognized. It appears to have inspired some people, and probably quite a few in America, to recognize that there exists an alternative to having to bow to the deep state apparatus that has imprisoned much of the world with deep corruption, deep hatred, deep lust for war and destruction, and a deep fear of human development, cultural development, economic development, and universal sovereignty. The deep state that one hears being referred to increasingly is not a government, nor any government, but is a hidden force of oligarchic powers. Some call it empire, some call it the invisible hand, some call it the one that has no face, that operates deeply hidden and controls the governments of nations with war and money, and directs the thinking of society with its private ownership of the media. It furnishes society's opinions, whom to love, whom to hate, and what to accept as the truth. And it furnishes your wars. As the old saying goes, the first casualty in any war is the truth. Then keep in mind that the deep state is always at war with humanity and has been at war for a long time, both for the deep state's survival and for its profits. The controlled mass depopulation of the planet is one of the deep state's cherished goals, for which humanity is said to be a cancer on the earth, and a climate villain under the modern global warming doctrine, or is defined as basically evil, as Thomas Hobbes had described humanity during the Dark Ages of the early 1600s, in order to justify the 30 Years' War. The deep state system has become a psychological war machine against humanity. And yes, the deep state is a cancer in the fabric of civilization. But this is fading. The healing of civilization has begun. Humanity is in the process of healing its wound. Mankind is at a turning point towards a world that is free of deep state cancers. China is already past that point. China has begun to succeed. where the story of the historic Swan Lake Ballet tragically fails. In the Swan Lake Ballet story, the union of humanity and civilization in a bond of universal love is not achieved. It stands as an ideal too great to come true. Thus the story still illustrates the Western world. Evil prevails, humanity dies, civilization remains out of reach. That's how the modern Swan Lake story ends. For China, the Swan Lake story merely signifies a challenge overcome and superseded with the dawning union of humanity and civilization in a bond of universal love. China has placed itself with its achievements in its pocket onto the world stage on September 4 to 5 at the G20 summit that it had hosted in its historic city, Hangzhou. Also note, so that nobody would miss the message, a medley of the Swan Lake dancing to Tchaikovsky's music was performed at the G20 opening. It was performed with the dancers dancing at the surface of a lake, dancing on the water, as it were. This was put onto the world stage by China, intermingled with traditional Chinese culture, a mere 2 months before the US presidential election. It demonstrated that the wind had turned into a new direction, a profoundly humanist direction. The new wind, combined with the changing climate in Palmyra by Russia, had evidently cleared some of the dense political smog that hung over the American election scene, which had obscured society's vision. Some people, seeing past the smog, may have asked themselves in America during the presidential election in 2016, who needs politics of perpetual wars? Who needs dreams of perpetual enemies? Who needs killing and maiming of people for regime change? People had asked themselves those questions already back in the mid-1600s. The outcome was the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, based on a higher sense of humanity and a commitment to support one another instead of tearing one another down. The commitment ended the 30 Years' War and established a new platform for civilization. History also tells us that the peace didn't last. New forms of the deep state system emerged that created new wars, new forms of terror, and new ideologies for hatred and depravity. The new wars were ever more openly wars for private profit and to destroy nations for profit. The Opium Wars against China were but an example. They forced the liberal looting of China and the white narcotics decimation from within, which nearly destroyed China. Today, after long strings of more wars and waves of hatred, the old questions are being asked again. Who needs war? Who needs terror? Can we get out of this trap? In this modern arena, aiming for the revival of civilization, Russia intervened and demonstrated to the world that terror can be defeated and war can be put aside with cooperation. It hacked into the old mentality of submission and hopelessness with a new vision for a human future. By Russia providing such answers with hope, more than a few people in the West may have inspired themselves to walk away from the deep state of degeneracy that had come to rule the political parties. Those who began to awaken may have changed ranks. They may have switched parties when they saw the faintest light of hope at the end, when they saw the faintest light at the end of the tunnel for America to have a future again, and likewise the world. This type of awakening tends to happen especially during election time, when the deep mire on the political landscape inspires despair in society. People become tired of seeing no hope, but seeing the stench praised as the pinnacle of civilization. Then someone comes along and says to the electorate, "I can make America normal again. I can make it a greatly respected nation in the world again. I can make America to become loved again by Americans, by rebuilding the country for everyone, to be proud of it again." Such speeches would have sounded like Lincoln speaking, or Franklin Roosevelt, or John Kennedy. Anyone standing for election to become president on this type of platform, standing against the deep mire of the deep state, could have won. A dentist could have won if he had the financial resources to wage a campaign. Power lay in the streets. Somebody evidently did pick it up and ran with it, and surprised himself that he succeeded and gained respect in the world and respect for America. The deep state is evidently so deeply rotten on the whole scene that the stench stands out to leak through the corroded walls of the private clubs of the party's machines, or is being leaked out for political games. The political parties have been declared by the Supreme Court of the USA to be private clubs. When something leaks out through the closed doors of the clubs, few people are surprised by the smell. The stench is expected, especially during election time. The stench therefore doesn't alter elections. What shapes elections is the sparkle of cultural optimism, something that hasn't been seen for a long time since the moon landing project. Cultural optimism that the moon landing project has sparked around the world was begun to be murdered with the assassination of President Kennedy, and was subsequently drowned in the gore of the Vietnam War. President Putin evidently hacked into the conscience of America by illustrating that there is an alternative to being drowned to death in the deep state, like America has evidently been, that has been so impoverished from within that it can no longer access the International Space Station that it had helped to build. America's poverty has become so deep that it now must, in consequence, break its own law, which prohibits cooperating with Russia, begging Russia to carry its astronauts to the space station that it can no longer do itself. The deep-reaching dismantling of NASA and its historic achievements had been a weighty campaign issue in the 2016 US election. NASA was once synonymous with national pride in technological achievements and with a vision for a bright future. Some of this has been so deeply buried that society is being induced to believe it never was real. Russia now carries the leading torch on this vital front. Russia carries the leading torch in the world because the deep state had effectively buried America's space capability as an evil demon which it had pioneered, which the deep state says is too expensive in money and not worth the effort. Russia's future-oriented paradigms had evidently hacked into America's depressed state of thinking, suggesting that the potential still exists for America to snap out of its slumber and become a great nation again. Actually, it isn't a hard challenge for America to become great again. Any president who picks up power in the street and follows the historic course that had made America great in the past is assured the status of greatness for simply repairing America's decaying transportation infrastructure and for restoring sanity into the banking system, as did Franklin Roosevelt with the Glass-Steagall Act. It doesn't take a genius for a president to be great when the course is already laid out in history. But it takes courage and wisdom to carry that torch. Whether or not what is required will be achieved remains yet to be seen. It appears that President Trump is aware of the economic development achievements wrought by China. He might even be aware that China's achievement could serve as a model for America for the fulfillment of its hopes. However, it appears that President Trump is unaware of the greatly advanced cultural background in China that had made the economic achievements possible, which Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake Ballet does illustrate. Very few people are aware of this connection, and fewer still are aware that the Swan Lake composition by Tchaikovsky in 1875 and 76 shares a common cultural background with the political founding of Canada as a dominion of the British Empire in 1867. While the past is history, the cultural growing up that the past has set into motion evidently still continues. It continues with new questions and remains a force that shapes the future. What is Canada? What is a nation? Is it a land? Is it a dominion? Is it a property? Is it a heritage of history? Is it a people? Is it a cultural identity? Is it a home? Is it a bastion of freedom? So the questions need to be asked. What is freedom? And it needs to be asked for the sake of the future.